You know the image, the devil, Pan, countless demons, maybe even the horned gods and figures of the Celtic past and of ancient Britain and Europe. Again and again horns appear. Whatever their context, they seem to adorn characters who exist just beyond the human world. We tend to think of these figures as products of myth, stories invented by cultures we can name. But how far back does this image really go? At the edge of what archaeology can show us, there is a horned figure, seated, surrounded by animals. It is this mysterious figure, along with a few other classic horned forms, that we'll explore now. If you're interested in ancient symbols and the questions they leave behind, please do consider liking the video and subscribing. We really appreciate the support. To understand the horned god, we have to follow the image, not the stories we tell about it. Let us begin. There is a symbol that often unsettles before it is understood. Horns, not as decoration, not as metaphor, but as the marker of something powerful, something that exists at the edge of what we call human. Whether in old figures carved in stone, in modern images, or even in masked figures at festivals, parades, or ancient landscapes at dusk, the horned, humanoid head signals immediately, instinctively. This is familiar, but this is not like you. This possesses something you do not. In later traditions, horns became associated with evil and temptation. The devil wears them in Christian art, transformed into a warning. Many demonic figures are given strong, recognizable horned silhouettes, images designed to unsettle, to mark danger, to strike fear. Yet much of this fear may be conditioned, societal. Their meanings were not always fear. Only later were many of these figures demonized, rewritten, turned toward dread as organized powers sought to replace older beliefs and control the populations who revered them. In earlier worlds, horns were often symbols of the wild, of vitality, of communion with nature. They belonged to figures who moved through mist-filled landscapes, to dancers at firelit gatherings, to shamans at the edge of night. They marked liminal beings, those who stood between worlds, between human and animal, between the living and the unseen. Pan carries them in Greek mythology, god of wild places, of forests and mountains, where civilization thins and control falters. Across cultures, gods of fertility and abundance bear horns too. Kanunos in Celtic imagery, bullhorn deities in the ancient Near East. Again and again, the horned figures appear, across distances, across centuries. But repetition is not explanation. Why horns? Why this specific form to signal the divine, danger, the liminal? Why does power so often take this shape, half human, half animal, standing at the boundary between order and wilderness? The horned god appears in mythologies we can read, in stories we can translate, in religions we think we understand. But many of these are recent, comparatively. Writing is young, and so the names we know are young. The question feels modern in many ways, but the symbol is not. So how far back does this symbol really go? Further than scripture? Further than the oldest myth we can name? Further than most people expect? At the edge of what we can see clearly, there is a figure, seated, composed, crowned with horns, but we do not know its name. We are not trying to prove that all horned gods are the same god. It is not about forcing later religions backward onto early cultures, and it is not about drawing straight lines through time and calling them continuity. This is about tracing a recurring human instinct through material evidence, through what was carved, what was preserved, what survives. Archaeology gives us objects, symbols and forms It does not give us beliefs. It does not give us the prayers that were spoken, the names that were invoked, or the stories that explained why an image was made the way it was. Before writing, religion often vanishes. What remains is stone, clay, bone, and sometimes, if we are fortunate, an image clear enough to recognize even when we cannot interpret it. What we find may not be beginnings, they may be remnants, survivals, the earliest examples we can see, but not necessarily the earliest that existed. This matters, because when we move beyond written history, into the deep past where no text survives to tell us what people believed, we are left with images, and the images do not explain themselves. So when uncertainty appears in what follows, understand this. It is not a flaw, it is the condition. The evidence stops, the questions remain, and at the edge, there is a horned figure waiting. Horns grow from the skull, bone made visible, shaped by biology into points designed to gore, to defend, to establish dominance. A bull charges with its head lowered. A ram strikes with the force of its entire body behind the impact. Horns are a natural armament, power that does not require a tool, a blade, or a human hand. When a figure wears horns, or is depicted with them, it signals something immediate. This power does not come from civilization. It does not come from law, from forges, or from civilized places. It comes from the animal world, from the wild, from forces that existed before humans built walls and wrote codes or named their gods. Horns also mark fertility. The bull, the ram, the stag, animals of vitality, of reproduction, of the cycles that sustain life. To give a figure horns is to tie it to abundance, to rhythm, to the forces that ensure continuation. And horns are grown, not made. They emerge. They are not crafted or bestowed. They belong to the creature that bears them. This is not borrowed power. It is inherent power. So when a human figure is shown with horns, something shifts, and the boundary blurs. This is not fully human, not fully animal. It occupies the space between, and that space is where the sacred often lives. The horned figure represents power that does not answer to human order, power that predates it, and power that will outlast it. In parts of the ancient Near East, horns became a visual shorthand for divinity. By the late 4th and early 3rd millennium BCE, gods in Mesopotamia are consistently shown wearing horned crowns. Not literal animal horns, but stylized headdresses, tiered, deliberate, unmistakable. On Akkadian seals from around 2300 BCE, divine figures wear helmets crowned with multiple pairs of horns. On the victory stele of Naram-Sin, dated to around 2250 BCE, the king himself adopts the horned helmet, a shocking visual claim to divine status. Figures such as Enki, also known as Ea, god of water, creation and wisdom, are repeatedly shown with multi-horned caps in seals and reliefs from the Akkadian and early Babylonian periods. Even attendant or liminal divine beings such as the two-faced god Isimud bear horned headgear, marking their status beyond the human. The pattern is consistent. The horned cap signals instantly and unambiguously that this figure is not mortal. This figure operates on a different plane. We see this across Mesopotamian art, in Akkadian seals, in Babylonian and Assyrian reliefs. The convention is clear: horns mark the divine. This is the visual language refined over centuries. The symbolism is understood, codified, repeated. And as with many images and symbols, particularly when they appear across multiple places and times, and then evolve as people move and cultures change, scholars agree this suggests inheritance from something earlier. And when we look further back, past the cities of Sumer, past the cuneiform tablets, past the written records that allow us to name gods and read their myths, we find a civilization that shows the symbol not in part, not as a hint, but already fully formed. A place where writing exists but no one in this age can read it, where cities thrived but left no surviving mythology, where the archaeology is rich, but the meaning is silent. The Indus Valley. And in that silence, there is a seal. The Indus Valley civilization flourished for centuries across what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, reaching its height during what scholars call the mature Harappan period around 2600 to 1900 BCE. It was vast, urban, sophisticated in ways that still surprise archaeologists. Planned cities with advanced drainage systems, standardized weights and measures, trade networks stretching across continents. And it left behind a writing system we cannot read. Thousands of seals, thousands of symbols, no Rosetta Stone, no bilingual text. The script remains undeciphered, which means we have no myth, no king lists, no prayers, no names for the gods if they had gods in the way we understand the term. What we have is material culture, and among the artifacts recovered from the Mohenjo-Daro, one of the largest Indus cities, there are seals that have provoked debate for over a century. Possibly the most famous shows a figure, seated, legs folded in a posture that suggests control, composure, stillness. The figure clearly wears a headdress, and it is clearly that of horns, large, curved, unmistakable. Around the figure are animals, a rhinoceros, an elephant, a tiger, a buffalo. Creatures of power, arranged symmetrically facing outward. The composition is deliberate, balanced, and centered on our horned figure. The seal is small. The carving is worn, but the impression is strong, visually extremely powerful, distant in time, yet oddly modern and familiar in feeling. This doesn't feel like a human wearing a costume. While the horns do not necessarily appear to grow directly from the head, they dominate the image and the figure in a way that feels fundamentally different from the Near Eastern examples. In Akkadian and Sumerian art, horns are more subtle and appear to function as a smaller part amongst many other symbols, arranged as part of a broader system of divine regalia. In the Indus Valley, the horns are the first thing the eye is drawn to. Large, curved, powerful, they are not multiplied, stacked, or refined into formal crown. There is no clear tiering. Instead, two immense horns completely define the silhouette of the figure itself. Chronologically, this image sits close to the Akkadian world, perhaps around 2500 to 2400 BCE. Only marginally earlier, if indeed earlier at all. But visually and conceptually, it feels distant. It is seated amongst the creatures of raw strength and danger. The horns do not separate the figure from that world. They tie it to it. The posture is composed, controlled, disciplined, not aggressive and not dominating through force. Whatever this figure represents, the horns do not read as decoration alone. They feel integral, part of how the being exists in relation to the animal world surrounding it. Scholars continue to debate what exactly we are seeing here, but a horned headdress is the cautious description. The effect of the image is something else. This is clearly a figure of authority within the animal world, seated among them, not threatened by them, perhaps governing them. The horns do not simply mark divinity, they suggest embodiment. Especially in context, they suggest that occupation of the liminal space between human and animal. The space where we have seen, time and time again, that the divine appears to reside. Whether worn or inherent, symbolic or literal, their role is open to interpretation. We do not know the figure's name, We do not know the stories told about it. We do not know the rituals performed in its honour, if any were. But we know what someone chose to carve, and we know they carved it with care. Early interpretations, particularly in the mid-20th century, called this figure Proto-Shiva. The reasoning was clear. The seated posture resembles later yogic positions. The horned headdress echoes later Hindu imagery of Shiva as Pashupati, lord of the beasts. The connection felt natural. Some early interpretations also pointed to what appeared to be multiple faces on the seal, reading the surrounding forms as additional visages, echoing later depictions of Shiva as multi-faced, all-seeing, oriented in several directions at once. This interpretation remains highly debated, and many modern scholars are far more cautious, arguing these features may instead represent ears, symbolic elements, or compositional ambiguity, rather than literal faces. The gap between the Indus Valley civilization and the earliest Hindu texts is immense, well over 1,000 years. The Vedas, the oldest Hindu scriptures, do not describe this figure. There is no unbroken chain of transmission. Calling it Proto-Shiva is speculation, not evidence. Some scholars argue there may be continuity, that elements of Indus belief survived, transformed, embedded in later practices. Others argue we simply do not know, that the silence is real, and filling it with later names is a mistake. And so the debate continues. We can say this. Someone in the Indus Valley, over 4,000 years ago, carved a horned figure surrounded by animals. And whatever it meant to them, it mattered enough to preserve in stone. We can read the image even if we cannot name it. The posture suggests mastery, but not through violence. The figure does not hold weapons, it does not strike, does not dominate through force. The control, if that is what it is, comes from presence, from centrality, from stillness at the centre of wild motion. The animals are not subdued. They are not chained or broken. They simply exist around the figure, arranged, balanced. This may suggest authority within the animal world, not over it. A figure that belongs to that realm, that speaks its language, that holds a place of power among creatures humans fear. The horns tie the figure to fertility, to vitality, to the cycles of growth and decay that sustain life. The bull, the ram, the stag, animals of regeneration, of continuation. To wear their horns is to claim their force. And the liminality, the in-betweenness, may be the most important element of all. As we've said, not fully human, but not fully animal, existing at that boundary. And boundaries are where the sacred often resides, the threshold between the known and the unknown, between the order and the wilderness, between the civilization and the forces civilization cannot contain. This figure may have represented a god, a spirit, an ancestor, a symbolic ideal, we do not know. But the image communicates power that does not come from human systems. Power embedded in nature itself, power that predates the cities, agriculture and writing. And that power wears horns. This may be as far back as history allows us to see clearly at the moment. The Indus Valley seal is not necessarily the first horned figure ever carved. It is the earliest one that survives in a form we can examine, analyse, debate. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Was this image newly invented in the Indus Valley time? Or was it inherited from something older, passed down through generations, through cultures that left no cities, no seals, no stone? Why don't we see earlier examples? Perhaps because earlier peoples did not carve in stone? Perhaps their sacred images were painted on bark, woven in cloth, shaped from wood or clay that returned to the earth. Perhaps the horned figure existed for centuries, for millennia, in materials that simply do not survive. Or perhaps this is the beginning, the moment when someone first gave the sacred this particular form? We cannot know. And what we can say is, by the time writing appears, by the time we have myth, gods, and we can name, the horned figure is very much present, already recognizable, already powerful. Which seems to mean the instinct, the impulse to imagine sacred power with horns, is older than scripture, and older than theology, and older than the written word. And if it is this old, the big question, how much further back does it go? We are standing at the edge of what can be known, and beyond that edge, there is only silence, yet a gentle presence. Before there were names, there were images. Before there were myths we could write down, there were carved symbols. And among those symbols, the horned figure appears. Not as evil, not as corruption, but as power embedded in the natural world. Power drawn from the animal, from the wild, from forces that sustained life and threatened it in equal measure. The Indus Valley seal may be the oldest clear example we possess, but it is almost certainly not the oldest that existed. Somewhere, in materials that did not survive, in cultures that left no evidence, the horned figure may have been carved, painted, worshipped, feared and revered. We will never know those earlier forms, the silence is total. But the pattern persists, across cultures and across millennia. The horned god reappears in different forms with different names, serving different functions, yet always carrying the same fundamental symbolism. Power that does not come from human order, power that belongs to the threshold between the known and the wild. Why does this form recur? That question reaches beyond archaeology, beyond history, into something far older. Something about how humans understand power on a very primal level. How we imagine the forces we cannot control. How we give them shape so that we can meet them, so that we can have a relationship with them. The horned figure is not one god remembered. It is one response repeated, and the response is ancient. How ancient, we may never fully know. But when you see horns on a sacred figure, whether in the ancient seals, medieval carvings or modern reinterpretations, you are looking at something that predates the scripture, predates the empires, predates the written word. You are looking at one of the oldest ways humans have tried to make sense of power. And it is still watching. If you enjoyed this dive into the horned gods of our past, please do consider subscribing. If you see horns in the shadows, in the space between the wild and the ordered world, remember, this is an image born of instinct and presence, and it never needed to explain itself.